I'm Muriel Tanner, 69 years old, and I still wake up on the first ring like I did when I worked nights in the ICU. This time the call came at 5 in the morning, and even before I picked up the receiver, I knew something was wrong. Kenneth had gone fishing with his friends the night before. He wasn't supposed to be back until late morning. When I heard the voice on the line say they were calling from Anaheim Memorial, I sat up straight and gripped the phone with both hands. What followed were words I had once spoken to other families, now being said to me, and nothing in all my years of nursing had prepared me for how they'd feel before I go any further. Let me know where you're listening from in the comments and hit that like and subscribe button. If you've ever had to hold your world together when it was falling apart. I met Kenneth when I was 21 and newly licensed. He brought in his beat-up Ford pickup for his cousin who'd broken a wrist and couldn't drive it home. I gave him a citation for parking in a staff zone. He smiled and asked if I wanted coffee instead of an argument. 6 months later, we were married, and by the time we bought our first home in Anaheim, I was pregnant with our second child. We never had much, but we stretched every dollar until the ends met, and somehow we made it work. I worked nights so I could be home when the kids got off school. Kenneth ran a small repair garage and coached youth baseball when he could. Our children, Iris and Gareth, were raised to say, please and thank you to share what they had, and never put themselves above others. And we believed if we lived that way long enough, the rest would take care of itself. Iris became a teacher, just like she'd always said she would. Steady, loyal, thoughtful. She married a man named Darren, who worked in accounting, and together they gave us 2 grandchildren, Troy and Winslow, who filled our weekends with laughter and scraped knees in school projects that covered the kitchen table. Gareth was different from the beginning, quick to charm, but quick to pull away too. He left for college in San Diego and didn't come home much after that. After he met Sheridan, the distance got worse, the visits shorter, the conversations thinner. Sheridan came from money and wasn't shy about letting that show. The first time we met her, she wore heels to our backyard barbecue and told Gareth in front of everyone that his mother's hands looked tired from all that working class stuff. I let it slide. Kenneth brushed it off and said she was just young, but even young people know how to be kind. When I called Iris that morning, she answered on the first ring. Mom, is something wrong? I told her straight. Your father died last night at the hospital. They did everything they could. Her voice cracked, but she said she'd be here within the hour with the kids, and Darren Gareth didn't answer right away. The phone rang 5 times before he picked up. Groggy, I told him what happened and asked him to come. He paused so long I thought the call had dropped. Then he said, Mom, Monday is Sheridan's birthday. We've been planning this party for months. Maybe we could move the funeral to Tuesday? I stared at the kitchen counter where the tea kettle had just started to hiss. The cup in my hand trembled, but I set it down slowly so it wouldn't spill. Your father is dead, I said evenly. The man who raised you, who helped you through school, who gave you a down payment on your home, and you're asking if we can reschedule his funeral because of a birthday party. It's not just a party, Mom, he said. His voice clipped. It's my wife's birthday, and we've invested a lot into this. I remembered holding him as a newborn 36 years ago, the way Kenneth cried when he saw him for the first time, how they used to fix bikes together in the garage, or fish on Saturday mornings. And now I was hearing him say those words. I hung up before I said something I couldn't take back. Iris arrived soon after with the kids. Winslow ran into my arms, whispering, Grandpa died, and Troy placed a hand on my shoulder and said, I'm sorry, Grandma. He was the best. We sat in the living room for a while, just being together. Darren made coffee, and Iris handled the rest of the calls. The house filled slowly with the quiet rhythm of morning. Gareth called again that night and said, maybe he could stop by for an hour before the party just to say goodbye, he said. I told him the service would be at 2 and not to worry. His father would have understood that a birthday party was more important. Then I hung up again later that night. Iris poured me a glass of wine. We sat at the kitchen table while the kids slept upstairs. "Do you think he'll come?" she asked. He made it clear. I said he won't. And that's when I felt something inside me start to shift the string I had been holding on to for years. Something stretched too thin by disappointment finally gave way. And in the morning, when the sun rose too bright for a day like that, and the streets of Anaheim looked too normal for a world that felt empty, I opened my closet and chose the black dress I'd worn to my sister's funeral, and I knew I would be wearing it alone. The morning of the funeral came bright and quiet, too bright for what the day was. I stood at the window in my bedroom, watching the sun cast gold across the rooftops of our neighborhood. It should have been gray overcast, something that matched the ache in my chest. But the sky was clear, and the light kept coming. Iris knocked gently and peeked in. "Are you almost ready? Darren says it's time to go." I turned from the window and nodded. My dress hung neatly on the hook black, simple the one I'd worn to my sister's funeral. I had hoped I wouldn't need it again so soon. Downstairs, the family was gathered near the door. Troy stood tall and silent in his dark suit, looking more like a young man than the 15-year-old boy who had once raced toy cars across my kitchen floor. Winslow wore a black dress with a white collar and held a small bouquet in her hands. "I picked them for Grandpa this morning," she said, holding them out. They were his favorites. I took the flowers from her and felt my throat tighten. "He would have loved these," I said, kneeling to hug her. She smelled like the apple-scented shampoo I kept in the upstairs bathroom, familiar and soft. We stepped out into the sun, and Darren helped me into the car. On the way to the church, I watched the streets of Anaheim pass by places filled with our history. The grocery store where Kenneth never strayed from his list. The little park where he'd taught the kids to fly kites. The gas station where he'd met Walter 30 years ago after an accident left them both waiting for hours and talking about fishing. It was Walter who'd taken Kenneth on that last trip. The church was already half full by the time we arrived. Not a grand cathedral, just the same modest Methodist church where Kenneth and I had been married 44 years ago. Back then, the pews had been filled with lilies and blue ribbons. Today, people wore black and gray, and the air held a kind of stillness that only grief can bring. Walter was at the entrance, standing stiffly in a suit that didn't quite fit. His face looked hollow. "Muriel," he said, stepping forward. "I'm so sorry." If I'd known, if there was anything I could have, I placed a hand on his arm. "You did what you could," I said. He spent his last evening doing what he loved with a friend he trusted. "Don't carry that weight." He nodded and stepped aside to let us in. I sat next to Kenneth's sister Lorraine in the front row. She squeezed my hand as we settled in. Her eyes searched the room and then turned toward me. "Where's Gareth?" she whispered. I didn't answer right away. Eventually, I just shook my head. Her lips pressed together, but I could tell she understood. The priest began to speak, words about love loss and eternity. I heard them, but they felt distant. My eyes were fixed on the wooden casket at the front, covered in white lilies. The flowers Iris had ordered because Kenneth always said they reminded him of our wedding day. When it was time for remembrances, I stood first. My knees wobbled, but my voice held. Kenneth Tanner was a good man. I said plain and simple, not perfect, but steady, reliable. The kind of man who showed up every day of his life, whether you deserved it or not. I shared how we met me a nervous young nurse who backed into his old pickup in the hospital parking lot. How instead of yelling, he asked me to coffee. How we married 6 months later because, in his words, when it's right, why wait? I told them about the little house we'd bought on Hawthorne Drive, how he worked extra shifts so the kids could attend good schools, how he showed up to every parent-teacher night even after 12-hour days on his feet. I didn't mention the hard years, the separation, the therapy, the near divorce. That was ours, and we'd made it through. Kenneth believed real love wasn't a feeling, it was a choice you make again and again. My voice caught as I looked toward the row of pews where Gareth should have been, and he made that choice every day. I returned to my seat, and Walter stood to speak next, fumbling through a story about a fishing trip gone sideways, ending with a laugh that turned into a sob. Kenneth's old supervisor from the shop followed, praising his work ethic and loyalty. Then Iris stepped forward, her voice steady but her eyes full. She talked about the nights he stayed up late helping with science fair projects, how he taught her to drive in the empty high school parking lot. Even Troy spoke, surprising everyone. He said his grandfather had taught him how to fix a chain on his bike and how to keep going even when you felt stuck. At the cemetery, the air had cooled. We watched as Kenneth's casket was lowered into the ground. I stood beside Winslow, holding her hand. "Will Grandpa be cold down there?" she asked quietly. I crouched beside her. "He's not really there, sweetheart. That's just his body. He's somewhere better now. And right here too," I said, placing her small hand on her chest. She nodded seriously, then stepped forward and laid her bouquet gently on the mound of earth. Back at the house, the guests came and went. Neighbors brought food. Old co-workers lingered over coffee. I stayed mostly in Kenneth's chair, thanking people, listening to the same question over and over. "Where's Gareth?" "He had urgent business," I told them. Nothing more. By evening, only close family remained. Lorraine was staying the night. Iris and Darren would be there all week. After the kids went to bed, Darren opened a bottle of Kenneth's favorite whiskey, the one we'd been saving for a special occasion. "To Kenneth," he said. "To a good man." We echoed it and drank. The burn of the whiskey was sharp, but it grounded me. Lorraine shook her head. "I still can't believe Gareth didn't come." "It was Sheridan's birthday," I said. "They had a party planned." Iris didn't speak, just sipped her drink and looked away. Later, after the kitchen was cleaned and the house had gone quiet, I found myself sitting in the dark with a photo album on my lap. Images of Gareth filled the pages. His first day of school. His arm around Kenneth, proudly holding up a fish. A Christmas morning where he wore the flannel robe I'd sewn for him myself. Somewhere between those pages, something had shifted. A distance had grown so slowly at first I didn't see it. In the final photo, he was standing next to Sheridan at Iris's wedding, not smiling, just there. Present in body, but already somewhere else. I closed the book and set it on the table. Then I reached for the envelope I'd taken from Kenneth's desk drawer. It held our will written 10 years ago, last updated 5 years back. The cabin up in the mountains was supposed to go to Gareth. He'd always loved it, spent summers there fishing with Kenneth, helping stain the deck, skipping rocks across the lake. But I knew after this week, after that call, he wouldn't keep it. He'd sell it. Fold it into some business plan. Cash in a legacy for a short-term fix. I would call our lawyer in the morning. Not to punish Gareth, but to protect what mattered. The next morning, I woke before the sun, as if my body had forgotten how to rest. For years, I'd started my day this way, moving quietly through the house so I wouldn't wake Kenneth or the children, putting water on for coffee, laying out breakfast, making sure there were clean socks in every drawer. Now the house was too quiet, every sound magnified. The click of the kettle, the hum of the fridge, the creak of the floorboards under my feet. I took my mug and sat in Kenneth's old chair, staring out at the yard. The grass was damp and shining, and there was a chill in the air that made me pull the sweater tighter across my shoulders. Iris came down not long after, still in her robe hair, tousled from sleep. She sat beside me on the arm of the chair and leaned her head against my shoulder, not speaking. We watched the sun creep up behind the neighbors' rooftops, turning the sky soft pink and gold. After a while, she squeezed my hand and went to start breakfast for the kids. I stayed where I was, holding my mug, listening to the sounds of life carrying on upstairs. Winslow laughing Troy's heavier footsteps, Darren whistling as he shaved. The phone rang just as I finished my coffee. I glanced at the display, half hoping, half dreading. It was Gareth. I let it go to voicemail. I wasn't ready for another conversation about what he could or couldn't manage, not today. Not while the ache in my chest was still fresh and sharp. I put the phone aside and focused on what had to be done. By mid-morning, the house was full of gentle chaos. Iris made pancakes for the children, and the smell drifted through the rooms. Darren helped me track down a few insurance documents. Lorraine sat at the kitchen table, quietly organizing a stack of condolence cards into neat piles. The whole time, my mind wandered back to summers at the mountain cabin, back to the quiet moments when Kenneth would catch my eye across a crowded room and give a little nod, as if to say, "We're in this together." That afternoon, after the last thank you note had been written and the dishes put away, I slipped upstairs and opened the closet. Kenneth's slippers were still by the bed, and his old blue sweater lay folded on the chair in the corner. I picked it up, pressed it to my face, and breathed in that familiar scent motor oil aftershave, something warm that was just him. For the first time since the call, the tears came. Not loud, not wild, just quiet tears, the kind that slide down your face when you're too tired to fight them off. It wasn't just Kenneth I was mourning. I felt the loss of the life we'd built, the years spent side by side. The comfort of routine, the small joys and daily burdens shared. The steady presence of someone who always came home even after an argument or a long day. I thought of Gareth too, and the gulf that had grown between us. The questions I asked myself in the silence. Where did we go wrong? When did the distance begin? Why did I hold on to hope for so long? When I came back downstairs, Winslow was waiting for me in the hallway. She reached up to hug me, small arms around my waist. "Are you sad, Grandma?" she asked, looking up at me with Kenneth's eyes. I nodded and smoothed her hair, grateful for her honesty. "Me too," she whispered, "but I think Grandpa is watching us from heaven." I knelt down and hugged her tight, letting her belief wrap around both of us for a moment. The days blurred together. We made lists of what needed to be sorted, what bills to pay, who to call. Meals were simple soups, sandwiches, casseroles from neighbors who remembered birthdays and anniversaries, and always sent something in times of trouble. In the evenings after the kids had gone to bed, Iris and I would sit in the kitchen with tea or a glass of wine, not talking much, just being together. Once late at night, she asked, "Do you think Gareth will ever come around?" I took a long time to answer. "Your father always hoped he would. Maybe I did too. But some things can't be forced." She nodded, looking down at her cup. The silence between us was gentle, not strained. Sometimes that was all there was to say. On Sunday afternoon, I walked through the backyard alone, watching the wind move through the branches of the old oak tree. The treehouse Kenneth built was still there, faded but sturdy. Iris had spent hours up there as a girl, reading with her legs dangling through the window. Gareth had used it too, though he'd left it behind sooner, calling it childish by the time he turned 13. I stood at the base of the ladder, running my hand along the wood. It felt like touching the past, a piece of him, a piece of the family we'd once been. Inside, Lorraine had fallen asleep on the couch, with a magazine on her chest, and the house was quiet except for the faint sound of television from the kids' room. I sat down with the photo albums, paging through old snapshots. Birthdays, graduations, holidays. Kenneth with his arm around Iris at her college graduation, Troy in a Halloween costume, Winslow chasing bubbles across the grass. And Gareth, smiling, laughing, holding up a fish at the cabin, then gradually growing more distant in the pictures. The last photo of all was from Christmas 3 years ago, Gareth standing by the door, already reaching for his car keys. I closed the album and set it aside, feeling a weight in my chest that was heavier than grief. It was the realization that the family I'd worked so hard to build, to hold together, wasn't whole anymore. Kenneth was gone. Gareth was a stranger. And I didn't know if either of those things would ever change. That night, when the rest of the house was asleep, I found myself in the kitchen with a cup of tea, listening to the quiet. The hum of the refrigerator, the soft tick of the clock, the distant rumble of a car passing by. I thought about what would come next, the calls, the paperwork, the meetings with the lawyer. But most of all, I thought about what it meant to let go. To let go of the life we'd planned, to let go of the son who'd chosen a different path, to let go of the hope that things would ever be just as they were. As I turned out the light and made my way upstairs, I paused in the hallway outside the kids' room. Winslow was asleep with her arm draped over her brother, both of them breathing slow and steady. I stood there for a long moment, watching the gentle rise and fall of their chests. There was comfort in their presence, a reminder that not everything had been lost. Back in my own room, I sat on the edge of the bed and pressed Kenneth's pillow to my chest. The world outside moved on, and I realized I would have to move with it, no matter how heavy my heart felt. I closed my eyes, holding on to the memory of his voice, his laughter, his hands on my shoulders when the day felt too long. The loss was sharp, but there was a kind of peace in the stillness. I told myself that tomorrow I would call the lawyer. Tomorrow I would begin again. And as sleep finally overtook me, I felt the faintest sense of resolve settle in a quiet certainty that I owed it to Kenneth, to Iris, to the grandchildren, and maybe even to myself, to protect what was left of our family and our story. I woke with the first gray light. The house silent, but for the sound of Winslow's gentle breathing from down the hall. For the first time in weeks, I felt something shift, a thread of resolve tightening inside me. I set my feet on the floor, pulled Kenneth's old sweater around my shoulders, and reached for my phone. I dialed Linwood Ellery's office just after 8, and the familiar voice of his secretary answered, calm and polite as always. "Mrs. Tanner, Mr. Ellery can see you this morning if you'd like." By 10 o'clock, I was parked outside the small office building downtown, hands folded tight in my lap. I'd sat in that waiting room before years ago, when Kenneth and I drew up our first will, then again when we added the cabin in the mountains and the education funds for the grandchildren. This time, I sat alone. My purse felt heavier than usual, weighed down with paperwork and the quiet certainty that something in our family was about to change. Linwood greeted me at the door, his hair thinner and more silver than I remembered, but his eyes still sharp and kind. "Muriel," he said softly, "I was so sorry to hear about Kenneth." He offered me coffee, but I shook my head. I just wanted to get started. He guided me to the same chair by his desk and opened the file marked Tanner Estate. We went through every detail piece by piece. I told him what I needed to change. The cabin, I said, should go to Iris and her children. He nodded, jotting notes on his yellow legal pad. And the bulk of our savings should be for the grandchildren's education. I want them to have the chance to go to college, to start their lives with something secure. Linwood looked up at me, then searching my face for any doubt. I met his gaze and nodded. "And Gareth?" he asked gently. I took a breath and let it out. "Gareth will get the minimum required. The rest I want to leave for Iris and the kids. And a few things of Kenneth's, His fishing rods, his old tools, the watch he wore every day. Those can go to Gareth if he wants them. Linwood set his pen down. Are you certain I was? He began drafting the changes, right then reading clauses aloud and waiting for me to nod. When everything was set, he promised to have the official papers ready by the end of the week. You've always been careful, he said. Always put your family first. I smiled a little and thanked him for being the kind of lawyer who remembers what matters most. Walking back to the car, the morning felt lighter somehow. The sun was out, glinting off the windshields along the street. I stopped at the grocery on the way home, picking up bread apples, a small pie for the children. Iris was waiting in the kitchen when I came in. How did it go? She asked, setting down her coffee. It's done, I said. I made sure things will be fair. She nodded, and for a moment, neither of us needed to say anything else. The day went on quietly. Darren took Troy to the library, and Winslow helped me plant marigolds along the back fence. Iris read in the living room, her feet curled under her. It felt peaceful for the first time in days. As I dug my hands in the cool earth, Winslow held out a stone she'd found. Look, Grandma, it's shaped like a heart. She pressed it into my palm, her small fingers sticky with dirt. I think Grandpa sent it from heaven. I tucked the stone in my pocket, the weight of it grounding me. Later after supper, I sat on the porch and watched the sky shift from blue to deep violet. I thought about Kenneth, about all the evenings we'd spent right here watching the world quiet down. I thought about the cabin, the years we'd spent teaching the children to fish, to roast marshmallows, to listen for the calls of night birds through the open windows. It felt right knowing that Iris and her children would keep those memories alive. After the kids were in bed, Iris joined me with 2 mugs of tea. Are you sure about all this, Mom? She asked softly. I turned the heart-shaped stone over in my hand. I am, I said. It's time to protect what matters. She reached over and squeezed my hand. The phone rang late that night. The house was dark, the only sound the distant hum of cars on the highway. I checked the screen, Gareth again. This time, I let it ring. I needed space, and so did he. As I climbed into bed, the house felt different. Not empty, but open, like I'd cleared space for something new to begin. Something built on the love and loyalty that Kenneth and I tried to teach our children from the start. I pulled his old sweater around my shoulders, closed my eyes, and let myself rest ready for whatever would come next. The letter from Linwood Ellery's office arrived on a bright Thursday morning. I'd been sorting laundry, distracted by the clatter of the dryer and Winslow's laughter echoing through the hallway. At first, I thought nothing of the envelope legal notices and bills had become a regular part of my days. But I knew the handwriting on the return address, and I knew the time had come for consequences to settle into place. That afternoon, Gareth called 3 times. I let each one go to voicemail. I could hear the pleading in his messages even when he tried to sound brisk and controlled. When the house grew quiet and the sun began to sink, I sat at the kitchen table and opened the letter, smoothing it flat with hands that trembled a little. Linwood's words were careful, every line measured and official. But the meaning was clear. My decision was done. The cabin would pass to Iris and her children. Gareth would receive only the minimum required by law, and a few of Kenneth's personal things if he chose to claim them. For a long moment, I just sat there, letting the silence wrap around me. Then I put the letter away and fixed supper, moving through the routine, as I always did. By the time the kids came in for dinner, the light had faded from the windows and the house was filled with the smell of chicken and rosemary. Iris caught my eye as she passed the plates. "Is everything all right?" she asked. I nodded. "It's just a lot, that's all." She squeezed my shoulder and set the salad on the table. I knew Gareth wouldn't wait long before trying again. Sure enough, the next day, he showed up at my door, his car pulling into the driveway in the middle of the afternoon. I saw him from the kitchen window, standing on the front porch, shifting from foot to foot. For a moment, I stood still, bracing myself. Then I wiped my hands on a dish towel and went to answer the door. He looked tired, older than his 36 years, with circles under his eyes and the faintest tremor in his hands. "Mom," he said, "we need to talk." I let him in and closed the door behind him, leading the way to the living room. He stood there for a moment, glancing at Kenneth's empty chair, then sat on the edge of the couch. He tried to keep his voice steady, but I could hear the desperation beneath it. "I got the letter. I don't understand. Why would you do this?" I sat in the armchair across from him, keeping my hands folded in my lap. "Gareth, I asked you to come to your father's funeral. You chose not to. That decision changed things." He started to protest, but I held up a hand. "You made a choice. Now I have too." For a long time, neither of us spoke. I could see the fight drain out of him, replaced by something like fear. Finally, he said, "I need that house, Mom. I need the money. Sheridan doesn't know how bad things are. She doesn't know about the loans, about the credit cards. I thought I could sell the cabin and fix it, but now?" His voice broke, and he pressed a fist to his mouth, trying to hold back the truth. He looked so much like the little boy I remembered, scraped knees, dirt on his face, running to me for comfort. But that boy was gone, replaced by a man caught in a storm of his own making. I took a breath and spoke gently. "Gareth, your father and I wanted to believe you'd always come home. But this time, you didn't. I'm sorry for what you're going through, but I can't undo what's been done." He sat forward, head in his hands, shoulders shaking. I waited, letting the quiet fill the room. At last he looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and pleading. "Can you help me? Not with the cabin, just help." I nodded. "I'll help with what I can, but there are conditions. You need to get honest, Gareth. With yourself, with Sheridan, with me. And you need to find help for what you're facing." For the first time, he seemed to listen. Really listen. He didn't argue or make promises he couldn't keep. He just nodded, slow and tired, and whispered, "Okay." I stood and went to the kitchen, pouring him a glass of water, letting him have the space to sit with his own thoughts. When he left, he paused in the doorway, looking back at the house, at me, at the hall, where he'd once lined up toy trucks, at the kitchen, where I used to pack his lunch. "I'll come by again," he said. "If that's all right." I nodded. "The door's open, Gareth." It always has been. After he was gone, I stood in the fading light and felt something loosen inside me. The choices had been made, his and mine. There was no undoing what had passed between us, but there was still room for something honest to grow in its place. In the quiet that followed, I found myself looking forward, not back. As night settled, the house felt calm and whole in a way I hadn't expected. The air was thick with the scent of marigolds from the garden, and in the soft hush of the evening, I understood that the hardest part was not the act of letting go, but the courage it took to start over. It rained most of the night after Gareth left, the kind of steady, gentle rain that settles deep in the ground and leaves the garden glistening at sunrise. I found myself up early, moving quietly through the house, gathering the mail and refolding the kitchen towels. Iris and her family were packing up to head home, and the usual clatter of breakfast was replaced by a softer hush. Winslow appeared first, dragging her blanket down the hallway and curling up at my feet while I started the coffee. Troy came next, taller every week, giving me a silent nod before fixing his own toast. The routines were ordinary, but they grounded me, steadying the world that felt so uncertain. By 10, the car was loaded, and the kids were hugging me goodbye on the front porch. Iris promised she'd be back by the weekend, and Darren offered to help with anything that needed fixing. I watched their car disappear down the street, then stepped back into a quiet house that seemed even larger now. I lingered in the kitchen, looking out the window as the rain eased and the sun began to break through the clouds, warming the garden beds Kenneth had tended every spring. That afternoon, Gareth called and asked if he could come by again. I told him yes. When he arrived, he looked different, tired, but less frantic, as if he'd made peace with the things he couldn't change. He stepped into the hallway, glancing around like a man returning to a place he'd nearly forgotten. We sat together at the kitchen table, and this time there was no tension in the air, only the slow, measured work of sorting out what could be salvaged. He told me about his debts, speaking plainly. "It got out of hand, Mom. I kept thinking one more deal, one more loan, and I could fix everything. I didn't want you to know." He looked at his hands, rubbing his thumb over the edge of the table. "Sheridan left. She took some time at her parents'. I don't know if she'll come back." I poured him coffee and let the silence grow comfortable between us. After a while, he asked if there was any way I could help him pay off some of what he owed. I thought about what to say. "I won't give you money outright," I told him. "But I'll help pay down the loans with the highest interest if you get help for what's behind all this. You have to see someone who understands addiction, Gareth. You have to be honest with Sheridan, too." He nodded, relief and embarrassment flickering across his face. "I will. I know I need to. I'm ready to do the work, Mom." There was a pause, then he added, "Thank you. I mean it." For the first time in a long while, I believed him. He asked about the old Mustang in the garage, Kenneth's project that had sat untouched for years. Troy always wanted to work on it with Dad, he said. Maybe I could finish it. Maybe it would help. I told him that would mean the world to Troy and to me. We spent that afternoon going over paperwork, making a plan for how I could help without enabling the patterns that got him here. I wrote out checks to cover some of the worst debts, but kept copies and receipts for everything. We set up a schedule for Gareth to check in each week to show me he was following through on his part of the agreement. Late in the day, I made soup, and we ate quietly, sunlight drifting through the kitchen windows, dust motes swirling in the air. Gareth lingered after the dishes were done, walking out to the garage and running his hand along the fender of the old Mustang, as if it was the first time he was really seeing it. He turned to me and said, "I'll come back Saturday morning. Troy and I can start then." When he left, the house felt changed. Not whole, not yet, but no longer empty. There was a new steadiness to the quiet, as if hope had slipped in alongside the sorrow and settled itself in the corners of each room. That evening, I wrote a note to Iris telling her what had happened and inviting her and the children over for Saturday breakfast. I told her Gareth wanted to see Troy, that maybe the two of them could work on the Mustang together. She texted back, "We'll be there. Troy will be over the moon." As I turned out the lights and made my way to bed, I thought about Kenneth, about the legacy he left behind. Steady hands, patience, the courage to face mistakes instead of running from them. It wasn't the ending I ever would have chosen, but maybe it was a beginning all the same. Saturday morning came with a cool breeze and the smell of fresh-cut grass drifting in through the open kitchen window. I got up early, letting the sunlight spill across the kitchen tile as I started a batch of pancakes for the grandkids. Iris and her family arrived just after 8, bringing a little rush of voices and laughter that filled the house with life again. Winslow chattered about her science project. Troy hovered at my elbow, asking if Gareth would be there soon, and even Darren seemed lighter taking out the trash without being asked. By 9, Gareth's car pulled up in the drive. He paused at the end of the walk, shoulders squared, but eyes uncertain, as if he was bracing for something he couldn't name. I met him at the door, letting him in with a nod. Iris and Darren greeted him quietly, and Troy was already tugging his uncle toward the garage, eager to begin the work they'd talked about all week. The old Mustang sat waiting just as Kenneth had left it, its hood-up tools spread across a battered workbench, the paint of faded blue that caught the morning light. Gareth stood for a long moment with his hand on the fender. Troy hovered nearby, holding a rag and watching eyes wide. "Dad always said we'd finish this together," Gareth said, his voice low. Troy nodded. He wanted us to take it for a spin when it was done. 3 generations. They set to work, falling into an easy rhythm. I could hear their voices through the open window. Troy asking questions, Gareth explaining each step, his tone patient and steady. Iris came and stood beside me at the sink, drying breakfast dishes and glancing out at the garage. "It's good for both of them," she said softly. "For all of us." I nodded, feeling a quiet gratitude settle over the kitchen. Later, Gareth came in to wash his hands, grease under his nails, and a tired smile on his face. He sat down at the table, accepting a cup of coffee. For the first time in a long while, his eyes were clear, his words unhurried. "I started seeing a counselor, just like we talked about," he told me. "It's hard, but I'm doing it. Sheridan's still staying at her parents'. She said she needs more time." He looked down at his coffee, swirling the mug between his hands. I told her everything. No more hiding. Winslow ran in with a bouquet of wildflowers from the yard, pressing them into Gareth's hand. "For you and Grandpa," she said. He nodded, swallowing hard, and tucked the flowers into his pocket. The kids pulled him back outside, and soon I could hear the sounds of the Mustang's engine turning over, faltering, and then catching at last. The garage filled with cheers, and I stepped outside to watch as Gareth and Troy grinned at each other, arms slung over each other's shoulders. Iris joined me on the porch, her voice soft. "He's trying, Mom." "I really think he is." I squeezed her hand. "I see it." The afternoon rolled on the garage door, left open to let in the light and breeze voices drifting through the house. At lunch, we ate together at the big oak table, Darren carving the roast, Winslow telling stories about her teacher Troy, making plans for the next phase of the Mustang restoration. For the first time since Kenneth's funeral, there was laughter in the air, and something like hope. When Gareth stood to leave, he paused in the hallway, looking at the photographs that lined the wall. He touched one, a picture of him and Iris as children muddy from the creek. Kenneth crouched beside them, grinning wide. "Thank you for not giving up on me," he said quietly. I nodded, meeting his eyes. "This family isn't about giving up. It never was." He hugged Troy, and Winslow clapped Darren on the shoulder and turned to Iris, their embrace a little longer than usual. Then he faced me, standing there. In the afternoon light, the lines of worry faded from his face. "I'll be back next Saturday," he promised. "We've got a lot of work left to do." After they all left, I sat in Kenneth's chair by the window, looking out at the driveway where the Mustang gleamed beneath the garage lights. The house was quiet again, but not empty, not anymore. There was still a long way to go, still healing to be done, but I felt something solid beneath my feet. Maybe it was forgiveness, or maybe just the comfort that comes when a family chooses to keep building together, even after everything that's been lost. As the sun dipped behind the houses across the street, I thought about the days ahead, about Troy and Gareth in the garage, about Iris stopping by with news from work, about Winslow's bouquets lining the kitchen windowsill. The future didn't look the way I'd pictured it, but it was ours, and it was real. And as the last of the light faded, I knew Kenneth would have been proud. The week drifted by, each day a little lighter, the house settling back into its old rhythms, but with something new woven through it. Saturday morning came again, and the sound of Troy's laughter spilled in from the garage, followed by the steady thrum of the Mustang's engine, rough but alive. Gareth was out there with him, sleeves rolled up, explaining carburetors and spark plugs, guiding Troy's hands just as Kenneth once did with his own. From the kitchen window, I watched them work together, pausing now and then to share a story or call for another tool. Winslow brought out lemonade and perched on the porch steps, her voice carrying as she asked question after question, always curious, never still. Later, Iris came by, bringing her famous potato salad and settling in at the kitchen table with me, both of us content, just to listen to the life unfolding in the rest of the house. She told me that Darren had been offered a promotion at work and that the kids were doing well in school, but her eyes kept drifting to the window, watching her brother and son side by side. "I never thought I'd see this again, Mom," she said quietly. "All of us together, not the way it used to be, but maybe something just as good." I squeezed her hand, feeling that quiet, bittersweet truth settle between us. Gareth came in for lunch, hands stained with oil, hair falling into his eyes. He sat down next to Troy, who had brought in a pile of car manuals and was already planning their next steps. Gareth thanked me for the meal and after a moment met my eyes. "I'm keeping my promise, Mom," he said, seeing the counselor, staying honest. "It isn't always easy, but I want you to know I'm not running from things anymore." I nodded, no need for big words. I could see the difference in the way he carried himself, in the way he looked at his family. The afternoon passed quietly. Winslow played in the backyard. Troy and Gareth returned to the garage, and Iris and I tidied up trading stories about Kenneth, how he once painted the fence crooked, how he'd wake up at dawn to make pancakes just because. For a while, it felt as if nothing had been lost, only changed, reshaped by time and hard lessons. Sheridan called once, and though her voice was hesitant, Gareth told her about the work he was doing, about being honest with himself. They agreed to meet and talk things through, no promises, just a willingness to try again, if and when the time felt right. That evening, I stood by the open window, listening to the soft hum of the neighborhood, the quiet clink of tools in the garage, the laughter drifting up the stairs. For the first time since Kenneth's passing, I felt the ache of loss give way to something gentler, a sense of peace, maybe even pride. Our family wasn't perfect. We'd stumbled, made mistakes, and hurt each other along the way. But we'd chosen not to give up on one another. We kept showing up, working through the pain, allowing space for forgiveness, and letting love do the slow, steady work of healing. Life doesn't always turn out the way you plan. Sometimes justice looks less like revenge and more like choosing to protect what matters most. Your dignity, your values, the people who still need you. If there's anything I've learned, it's that kindness and boundaries can live side by side, that it's never too late to start again, and that every day offers another chance to do better. Thank you for listening to my story. If it reminds you of your own family, or if you've ever had to draw a line between hope and heartache, I hope you'll share your thoughts or just take a moment to reflect. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, I'd love to have you join me again next time.